So the topic is dynamic imposition, and you may wonder what that means and why it is different than normal imposition, and that's exactly what I'm going to talk about a little bit today. But I want to start with a little bit of a recap on what imposition itself is inside of pdfToolbox, and I will take you through some slides. For those of you who know me and my webinars, you know that the number of slides will be limited. And then we'll look at an example of regular imposition inside of pdfToolbox desktop. And then afterwards, we'll look at what it means to do this dynamically with a nice example, I think, of a book where you want to create an imposition, but you don't know ahead of time what the width of the spine of the book is. So the width of the spine kind of influences where the information, where the front and the back are going to end up on the imposed sheet. So we'll use that as an example at the end of this video. First of all, terminology. There are two configuration files that we need to talk about. The first one is called Sheetconfig, and the second one is Runlist. And then there are some very key items that we want to talk about, and that is sheets and slots. So I try to keep this as short as I can while still explaining the basic properties of each. For those of you who have not done so, on help.callassoftware.com, once more, that is help.callassoftware.com, you'll find documentation for pdfToolbox, and in the regular pdfToolbox manual there is a whole chapter that talks about imposition and goes into all of these things that I'm introducing here in much more detail. So very briefly, what is a Sheetconfig? Well, that is a textual configuration file that defines sheets and slots. And that doesn't mean very much because we haven't defined what sheets and slots are yet. So why don't we do that right now? A sheet is typically the final format after imposition. So if you're putting pages from a book or something else together for on a press sheet, the sheet is the final size of the press sheet as it will be printed by your press. And that can be anything depending on the size of the press and the size of the paper that you're using, of course. In the imposition engine inside of pdfToolbox, a sheet is defined by two pairs of numbers, bottom left X and Y, and then the top right X and Y. Yeah. So typically the bottom left X and Y will be 0. So the first two numbers will be 0, 0. And then the other two numbers in that case are the width of the sheet and the height of the sheet. And you can use different measurement units. That could be inch, it could be millimeter. But you need these numbers to define what the final sheet size is going to be. And you'll, as I said, I have some examples of sheet configs and run lists as well, so you'll see how that looks in there, but that's the basic stuff. And this is important also because it shows you that in this imposition world, we use the same axis as in a PDF document itself. The XY axis, the origin, is always at the bottom left corner of the document. And for a sheet, that's exactly that way. We start by defining the bottom left corner, and then we define the top right corner. So what are slots? Well, if you have the sheet, you have to put information in it. And a slot is a rectangular area on the sheet. The example that I have here, I have 3 slots defined, and you could imagine that 2 of those are going to be used to put pages from an incoming PDF document into, the 2 big ones at the top, and the smaller slot we have at the bottom could be used for other information. Maybe there is a client name there, maybe we want to add a color bar, any of this. So slots are not exclusively used to put pages on a sheet. They can also be used to add additional information. But a slot is always a rectangular area on the sheet. Now, How does that look when we look at it from a Sheetconfig point of view? Well, you see a complete example of a Sheetconfig on your screen right now. It's a lot of numbers, I know, but in essence, it is not that difficult. And it's only 4 lines. I've split up the lines for the slots to make them fit on my screen, but in a text editor, those would also be 2 lines, or 1 line per slot, actually. And what we're looking at is the first line defines what the name of this Sheetconfig is going to be in pdfToolbox desktop. So this is how it is going to show up in my lists in pdfToolbox desktop. You'll see that in a second. The sheet then defines what these coordinates for the sheet are. So 0, 0 is the lower left corner, 450 millimeters and 320 millimeters is the top right corner, or otherwise said, 450 millimeters is the width of the sheet in millimeter, and 320 is the height of the sheet in millimeter. And then I have 2 lines that define a slot. And I will not go into all of the numbers that you see there, but the first number that you see is the unique ID of the slot. Then you can also make out the size and so on. So 10, 11 and a half, 210, 297 is again the lower left corner of the slot, and then the width and the height of it. The 3 millimeters that follow it are the bleeds that I want on all sides. 100, 100 means that I have no scaling whatsoever. The page is placed at full size. The 0 is a rotation, and then the rest defines binding edge, where the file is going to be placed into the slot. And then in this particular example, I want no crop marks or trim marks, and all of these N characters that you see on the last line for each slot tell pdfToolbox that I indeed do not want trim marks. Again, there is full documentation of this. If you go look at an example Sheetconfig in pdfToolbox, you'll also see that there are comments in that Sheetconfig, and those comments go over again all of the explanation that I just gave for these different numbers. So my goal is not to teach you from scratch how to create this, but simply to understand what a slot is. And then the last thing is a Runlist, and it's the second configuration file that is used for an imposition in pdfToolbox, and that second configuration file tells pdfToolbox what to do. The Sheetconfig defines the sheet. Again, that's the thing we have on the right hand side with the 3 slots on it that I have defined. And then the Runlist tells pdfToolbox, take the first page from the incoming PDF file and place it into the first slot, so the slot on the left. Take the second page and place it in the slot on the right. So the Runlist contains the instructions that will tell pdfToolbox how to take the incoming PDF document and place different pages from that incoming file on the slots of the sheet. And while I have not shown that here, the Runlist would also allow me to specify the information that needs to come in the 3rd slot at the bottom. And we have some variables for that. You can place text in there. You can take variables that are defined elsewhere in a process plan, for example, or on the command line, and you can place those. You could place the date on there in different formats, and so on and so on. There's quite a bit of capabilities that you can add to this Runlist to tell pdfToolbox how exactly to do this imposition. And if you want to see what the Runlist looks like, it's very similar. We again begin with a name. In this case, the name again is how this will show up in pdfToolbox desktop. And then there are instructions. And if I read from the line that is said that is called new sheet instructs pdfToolbox to start a new empty sheet in our case. Position page takes a page from the original document and puts it in a slot. And then I have some calculations with this first page and last page parameter. And then at the bottom you can see that there is a second sheet created. Some more pages are put into slots. And then the last line is to make sure that the imposition will end by telling pdfToolbox that the number of pages runs out. We're expecting a 4-page document in this example. So if I set first page to 4, then pdfToolbox knows that all pages have been handled. So just a very simple example of that. And before we go to the next slide, I want to show you what that looks like. So if you go to pdfToolbox desktop and you open the switchboard, the imposition stuff can be found under Arrange, and then under Arrange I have Impose, and in Impose I have these two pull down menus, and each of them has some settings in them. If I would go to a different library here, I would probably have different settings. So imposition settings are saved in the current library, just as profiles and process plans and so on are. What you see here, this name that you see for the imposition scheme, that's the run list, and the sheet configuration, which is the Sheetconfig, these names come from the text configuration file. That's the line that started with name that we saw in the presentation. If you want to take a look at what these files look like, we can go to Manage Imposition Configs, and that will open them in a browser window or a folder if you want. And then I'm just looking at which is the one that we were looking at in there. So if I say open with a text editor, and that could be Sublime or any other text editor, this is the example we had in the presentation before. So I have this name, which, like I said, defined how that looks in pdfToolbox desktop. And then I have the definition of the sheets and the definition of the slots. The run list is exactly the same. So if I go into that same folder and I open a run list file, again I can do that in Sublime, and this looks now a little bit more complex because it's already one that contains variable information, but you can see the format with one command per line. And what I really want to show is how that works. So what I have here as input file is the cover of a book. So this is the outside cover. This is the inside of the front cover. Then you have the inside of the back cover, and we have the back cover outside. So 4 pages that we want to put in an imposition. If you put this in imposition, you would expect this front cover and the back cover to end up on one sheet, and then the inside of the cover, these 2 pages, should end up on a second sheet. That's what we expect. And I will take a Sheetconfig and a run list. I will execute that, and what I get is exactly what I expect. I get a sheet that is 450 by 320, and then on the first page I end up with the front of the cover and the back of the cover. On the second page I end up with the inside of the front and the back cover. Yeah. So what you can also see is that the order in which you place pages into such an imposition doesn't have to be sequential. On the first sheet I actually end up with page number 1 and page number 4. So it's completely up to you what the ordering is going to be in the imposition. Okay. Very, very simple, I think. Well, I hope anyway. So let me go back to the presentation, and well, so far, of course, there is nothing that is dynamic about this whole thing, and we'll change that. How do you create dynamic impositions? And the trick is that in the run list, you can actually calculate. I have some limited calculation possibilities in there, but I also have commands that would allow me to update an existing sheet definition. So if I have a sheet config where I define that my sheet is 450 by 230, for example, then in the run list, I have commands that would let me update or change that. I also have commands in the run list to create sheets from scratch dynamically. So if I don't know ahead of time what the size of my sheet will be, because I don't know ahead of time what the size of the book will be that I'm imposing, for example, then I could use those commands to either modify a sheet that I have defined in my sheet config or create a new sheet from scratch. And the same thing goes for slots. I have a command that will look at a slot and then update it dynamically on the fly. And I have a command to create a new slot completely dynamically. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail, because this is really the key of making a sheet, an imposition dynamic, if you want. Both of these systems, with sheets and with slots, work in exactly the same way. And this can be a little bit awkward the first time you do it. The way they work is there are a long list of built-in variables that are defined by pdfToolbox. And you see 4 of them on your screen right now. And these have to do with sheets. So what you see there called sheet underscore def underscore media box underscore L is a variable that is defined automatically by pdfToolbox. And you can either look what the value is of that variable, or you can put a new value in there. And the lines that you have on there do exactly that. The set command takes a variable, either a variable that already exists or a variable that comes in from the command line or from the process plan outside the imposition environment, and it puts a value in there. So if I know that I want a slot or sheet in this case that is, let's say, 100 millimeters by 200 millimeters, I could define the left of the media box as 0, the bottom of the media box as 0, the width as 100, and the height as 200. I simply put those values in those variables. When I do that, I have not done anything yet. I simply filled those variables with information, but I have not created or modified a sheet yet. The 2 commands that you see at the bottom of the slide are which actually do the action. Set sheet will take an existing sheet ID and it will use the information from those variables defined before it to modify the definition of the sheet. New sheet will create a completely new sheet while you're doing imposition, and again it will use the variables to define what the sheet is that it creates. So if you want to create sheets dynamically, you will always have 2 parts in your run list file. The first part will define these variables, put all the information in there that you want in terms of sheet size. There are more variables like this. You can also define what the trim box is going to be on the sheet, for example. So the first part will set those variables, it will fill it with information, and then the second part will, for example, have a new sheet command that will create a new sheet based on the values in those variables. And the same theory is exactly similar, exactly the same for slots. In a slot, you have a whole list of variables that define all of the properties of the slot. I specify or I show you 4 of them here for the trim box, but if we go back to here, there are variables for each aspect of the slot. So not only can you define the width and the height of the slot, but you will also have variables for the bleed. You will have variables for scaling, rotation, what crop marks you want, the binding, the positioning of the page in the slot. All of those has these types of variables. And again, you will begin in your run list by having lines that define values for these variables, so that place information in those predefined variables, and then you will use one of the commands to either make a slot. Well, in this case, it's only making a slot. So you define the variables and then you make the slot based on those variables. This can be very tedious. If I want to define a slot from scratch, the list of variables is probably about 20. So I would have to fill 20 different variables, and then I can finally call this make slot to do the work. And there is a shortcut that you can take, and you'll see that shortcut in the example that I will tell you about in a second. And the shortcut is this capture slot command. Capture slot looks at a particular slot you have defined and puts all the information in those predefined variables. So going back, I have here a slot with unique ID 1 and a slot with unique ID 2. Both of them are defined for sheet number 1. I only have one sheet in this sheet config, so that's obvious. So slot number 1, slot number 2, I could say make slot sheet ID 1, slot ID 1. And that would look at the definition of that slot in the sheet config. It would read all of the information, and pdfToolbox would then automatically populate all of those variables like slot def trimbox L, trimbox W, trimbox H. It would populate all of those variables with the information of that particular slot. After that, I could modify the two things that I want to modify, and then call make slot, and that would modify the definition of the slot so that from that point on pdfToolbox uses what is new. That sounds very theoretical, so let's see this in practice. And the example I'm using is the same example we've seen before. I have this book. The book has an outside cover and an inside cover, and I want to do imposition for that. So this is what I want to do, as we saw in the example before. 4 pages coming in, 2 sheets coming out. And of course, the area in between the slots, this sign area that I have on my presentation here, is the spine. That's the thickness of the book. So how do I do this when I don't know ahead of time what the thickness of the book is? I get these things. I know that they are always the same page size, but I don't know how many pages, and each book can have a different number of pages, so each book will have a different thickness. How can I make an imposition config that handles that? Well, the way I've created the example is, what if I have a variable that defines the spine width? So there is an ordering system, for example. The ordering system knows how many pages the book that I'm putting in imposition has. That ordering system calculates what the spine thickness is going to be, and it passes that to us as a variable. And then I want to use that variable for the thickness of the spine, and using that, I want to create an imposition of the cover in such a way that the spacing is correct for that particular book. And of course, the pages keep nicely centered on my larger sheet. Now, that's not it, of course. I want to show you what we do with that. So In order to do that, I have a second imposition config that I'm going to be using, and of course we're going to do this with the same book here. And let me show you. Actually, I will drag this in here. That's a little bit easier. So let's look at the Sheetconfig to start with. This is the Runlists, and this is the Sheetconfig. Well, the Sheetconfig is not different than what we've looked at before. Let me see if I can make this a little bigger meanwhile. So this is the same Sheetconfig as we've dealt with before. The only difference is that this one also has comments in it, and you'll find these comments in most of the predefined imposition configurations in pdfToolbox, and they can help to remind you what all of these numbers mean. So my Sheetconfig still defines one sheet. Size of the sheet is always the same, 450 times 320. In my example, the pages that come in are portrait A4, so the width is 210 and the height is 297. That's why the width and height of my slot is defined as 210 and 297 millimeters. I have a predefined positioning of my slots, and then I specify millimeters, 3 millimeters of bleed on all sides. I specify that I want one-on-one, so no scaling, no rotation. Positioning of the page in the incoming slot is left top. That won't make any difference because the pages are A4 and my slot is A4, so they are always going to be an exact match. Binding edge doesn't interest us, and we don't want any crop or trim marks at this point. And again, that's all the comments that you see here. So the name, slot number, sheet number, trim box, bleeds, scale, rotation, placement, binding margin, and crop marks. This is not different from what we've done in the fixed case. If I take again the fixed example, this Sheetconfig doesn't have the comments, but it looks exactly the same. So, and this is important, the variability is not in the Sheetconfig. The Sheetconfig is static. The Runlist is the one that is making the difference in these types of imposition. And if I go to the Runlists, then you will see that in fact it is a lot longer. And before I explain in a little bit of detail what these things are, let me show the result. Now, I'm using the variable imposition, and I will simply execute that, and I'm getting the exact same result as I had with a fixed imposition. Why? Well, this imposition config uses a variable, the spine thickness, but when I'm running that imposition config inside of the switchboard, I have no way to change that variable. Yeah? So it's always going to use the default value. Now, in order to allow us to test with that, I've done something else. Of course, I could change the value in the default value in the run list, and I will show you in a second where in the run list you can find that. But that's not very user-friendly. And I will show you that I can make a process plan. This is a relatively simple process plan. It has a first step which defines a variable called book thickness, and the default value here is 10. So this is the book thickness in millimeters that I'm expecting. And then I have an action that uses the run list and Sheetconfig that we're talking about. So the first step will ask me for the variable, and then the second step will use it. And if I run this one, you can see that it says cover thickness in, or actually that should be book thickness in millimeters, and it suggests to use 10. Now, if we use 10, we're going to get exactly what we got last time, so I will use 20. And now it's going to ask me where to save the result. We're going to put that on my desktop. And you can see that the distance I get now between the pages of the cover is now 20 millimeter. And of course, I've calculated it in such a way that it is still centered on the page. So my margin right and left is now, of course, a lot less. Yeah? So that shows you that it uses this this variable and it does the imposition dynamically. Let me do this again just to make sure that I'm not cheating. I'm going to put this to 0. I would expect the 2 pages to touch in that case. I'm going to save it on our desktop again. And as predicted, the 2 pages of the cover now touch. It is still nicely centered on my sheet, but I have a lot more margin on the left and on the right, of course. Okay. So you can see that, in fact, the imposition config that I'm using, the imposition step that I'm using, is in fact a variable. And it is, in fact, also using that variable that I have defined here as book thickness. So how does that work? Well, we've already seen the Sheetconfig, and we've seen that there are no secrets in there, that Sheetconfig is exactly the same. Remember that I have these slots set up the way I want them. That's important in the run list. Yeah? So I do have them set up. They will not be in the right location. Depending on the thickness of the book, I will want to shift this slot, the first slot to the left or the right, and I will have to shift the second slot to the left of the left or the right to follow that. So I can't use them as they are, but they do define all of the other parameters that I'm interested in. The bleed and the rotation and the scaling and so on. They set all of that correctly. Now, what do I do in the run lists? And I'm going to go over this line by line. It's not that long, and the important part is, or the only difficult part actually, is up to this. The rest we've already seen. So don't despair, it's not going to take that long. The first thing is that in my process plan, I defined a variable, and the run list allows you to collect variables from the outside. So you not only have variables that are predefined by pdfToolbox, you also have variables that are coming from the outside. And the way I can do that is by saying, again, I have this set command. I'm going to give that a name, so I'm creating my own variable inside of this run list if you want. And then I'm using a function that is called environment, and that's the whole thing. Environment allows me to pull information, variables from the environment, and the environment in this case is my process plan that I have defined. What does it pull? Well, it looks for a variable called book thickness. If that variable exists, it is going to use the value that was defined for that variable, and it's going to put it in my run list variable. If it doesn't find a variable called book thickness, it is going to use the default value, which is 10 in this particular case. Yeah? And this is the type of variable that I expect. In this case, I'm expecting it to be passed on as a string, but I will still be able to calculate with that, so it doesn't really matter that much. Yeah. So that's this line. This line looks at what's the world outside of my imposition config. Do I have a variable called book thickness? If so, get the value of that. If I don't, use 10 as a default. And then, and this is a little bit of mathematics, if I know what the book thickness is, I can calculate where the bottom left corner of my first slot is going to be and where the bottom left corner of my second slot is going to be. As long as I don't know what the book thickness is, that's impossible to predict. But once I know how thick this book is going to be, what the width of the spine is, It's very simple. The spine is always going to be in the center of the sheet. So half the spine is going to be on one side, half the spine on the other side, and that lets me calculate what the bottom left-hand corner of my sheet, where that is going to be. In fact, the height of the slot is always going to be the same, or the Y position of the slot is always going to be the same. It's only the X position that is going to differ. And I calculate that here. So I'm assuming that my sheet is always going to be 450 millimeters in this case. You could make that a lot more dynamic as well, of course, but that wasn't necessary in this particular example. And then I calculate, based on the book thickness, what does that mean in terms of the position of the first slot. So this is where the left-hand side of the first slot has to be. And then based on the position of the left-hand side slot and on the thickness of the spine and the fact that each page is 210 millimeters, I calculate where my second slot is going to be. The result of these two calculations is the left side of the first slot, the left side of the second slot on my sheet, so that they will still be centered. And now comes the dynamic part. I told you about this command that is called capture slot. Well, here I say capture slot on sheet number 1, and the slot has slot ID number 1. If you remember the Sheetconfig, the slot with ID 1 on sheet 1 is this one. So capture slot reads all of the information from the first slot of my Sheetconfig. That is what this line means. Read the information out of the Sheetconfig for that particular slot. And then I'm overriding one particular piece of that information. So in the predefined variable slot def trimbox L, which is the left-hand side of that slot, I put this variable instead. What I just calculated. Why is it multiplied by something? Well, what I calculated here is in millimeter. My imposition engine works in this particular case with points. So I do the translation from one to the other. And then after I have set the new left-hand side of the slot, I call make slot to make it happen. So that actually modifies the definition of the slot as pdfToolbox uses it during the imposition. The same thing for the second slot, the right-hand side slot. Capture it, modify the left-hand side, and save that information. And once we have saved these two slots, so once we modified the information for these two slots, the rest of the imposition is exactly identical to the non-dynamic case. I'm putting the first page of the document into slot 2. That's this nice chinchilla here. The last page is going into slot 1. It's the back cover. And then I do the same on a new sheet with the inside of the front cover and the inside of the back cover. Yeah. So really all the hard work is done here. Here is where you get the information from the outside, where you calculate the new positions of the slots that you need based on the thickness of the book. And then you have the capture slot, make slot duos that will get the information from a slot, allow you to modify part of it, and then make the new slot. And then I have the same imposition as in the non-dynamic case. Okay, so I hope that was that made sense. It's a little bit of a technical thing to simply explain. It would be, and it will go much better once you start playing around with this yourself. As always, if you start playing around with this imposition stuff, build something that is very simple, it would be a good idea to have a one-page file, for example, that comes in, make a Sheetconfig that only has one slot in it, and then use the capture slot, make slot combination to look at what the result is when you start modifying these variables. If you want to know what these variables are, I think I'm right when I say that. So let me see if I can. I didn't think of testing this beforehand, but it would make sense to show you that actually. So let me open this one again, and let me just open the definition here. So if I do, if I do Runlist debugger at the bottom, so this enables the imposition debugger if you want. And if now I click on execute, I get the imposition debugger. And the cool thing about that, and this looks really interesting, right? The cool thing about this is that I can see if I can show you. It's not going to work here. So it shows you all of the variables that I have defined in my run list, but it also shows you all of the predefined variables. So when we talked about setting the trim box of the slot, for example, the left-hand side, well, here it is, slot def trim box L. So this shows you all of the slot variables that you can modify in here. It also shows you environment variables. So if you would look at this while you're running a process plan, it would also show you the variables that come in. So I could say continue, or step, actually step, and that sets a variable called the book thickness, and it sets it to 10. If I step again, it will calculate the slot 1 left, and that is now 10, and the slot 2 left is 230, and then capture slot modifies all of the variables that have to do with slot. I modify one of those to match, and then make slot modifies the definition of the slot as I have it inside of my Sheetconfig. Yeah? So the Runlist debugger can help you find what the variables are that you have. It also allows you, with this step feature, to go through a Runlist step by step and see what happens to your variables. And that can be very useful if you're trying to get something to work correctly. It's not always easy to get that to work from the first go. Well, this shows you what is going on inside of your run list, including these variables for the pages, for example. And you have a first page variable that is defined as 1 when you begin. Last page is automatically defined as the last page number in the document that comes in. If I step through this and I say position page, and then I'm going to count with the pages. So now first page is 2, and then last page is 3. So you can really follow what happens in your calculations, and that's a huge benefit when you start making your own imposition configs. So once again, if you have not used this Runlist debugger, you can, I'm going to get an error message now because I canceled it, of course. You can activate the Runlist debugger in the action menu for the impose action on the switchboard. Just select Runlist debugger. Also remember to deactivate it again at the end, or it's going to pop up automatically every time you run an imposition action. But it can be a huge help in what you're doing there.